stuff. And you know, the one thing that people come up to me and say most often, we're so glad you said that, is the following. When I was in a Ph.D. program in clinical psych at Duke University starting 1969-70, at the end of that first year, I got kicked out of the program on the grounds that I had weak ego boundaries. Now, what I realized later was, I was expressive and it made them uncomfortable. And I raised questions very politely, but it made them uncomfortable. And the reason that I think they feel like that's what they wanted to hear, is because almost nobody likes graduate school in clinical psych, right? It's not really enjoyable for most people. And so everybody ends up feeling like they must be crazy, there must be something wrong with them. And so when somebody just gets up and says, yeah, it was hell for me too, and they told me something was really terribly wrong with me, it's that human connection that you were talking about and the previous speakers were talking about. So as some of you may know, I was on 2 DSM-4 committees. I was an advisor until I found out how they worked. I used to be an advocate of the DSM because I love logic and I love research. And so I remember saying to my graduate students, this book is scientifically based. Because that's what my teachers told me, it's what the ads tell you, right, for the DSM. It's scientifically based, and so some people have gone through all of the research that relates to anything about mental illness, and they've culled through it, they've gotten rid of the bad stuff, and here is this beautiful thing with decision trees, I just love decision trees, and aren't we lucky to have it? And then I was on these 2 committees. And there's a whole chapter in my book, They Say You're Crazy, about the gatekeeping techniques I learned that they use to keep out what they don't want in the DSM and then to let in what they want to let in. And so I resigned in horror from those 2 committees, and I wrote They Say You're Crazy, and then I later co-edited a book called Bias in Psychiatric Diagnosis. And I can tell you in a nutshell what's in those books, because it relates to what we just heard and what I want to say about veterans. There are 2 things. One is that psychiatric diagnosis could not be farther from scientifically based. There is no science in the book. And I even did scientific research to prove that there's no science in the book. And I won't bore you with the details because that's not the main purpose today. The other point is that one time I had this image of, if you imagine psychiatric diagnosis, the whole enterprise of it as a sphere. And in it, it's supposed to be filled with science, right? But if you take out the fake science, then you've got this void. Now, what goes into that void? Every kind of bias you can imagine. So, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, and heterosexism, ageism, ableism, looksism, absolutely everything. And whatever happens to be in that therapist's mind. Because, as you know, most of the criteria in the DSM, they have terms like marked anxiety. Right? Well, what's marked? Who decides? It's your therapist. Hypoactive sexual desire disorder, what is that? It's whatever your therapist thinks is too little. All right? What's their sex life like? You don't get to know that and say, let's compare, we can argue this back and forth, let's find a reasonable standard. They just get to decide whether you're sick or not, and in which of the 374 ways listed in the current DSM you are sick. So it's not scientific, it's riddled with bias. None of that would matter if it succeeded in doing what they claim it does, which is gives us a common language. Well, a common language, come back to that in a minute, and helps us know how to treat people who are suffering. Hey, if it did that, I'd say go ahead, use it. I don't care if it's science, if it works to reduce suffering, go ahead and use it. But it doesn't. What the research shows is that, first of all, there are no correlations. There's no predictive value between the diagnosis somebody is given and what kind of help is effective and what the outcome is. There is no evidence of that. And then, of course, the DSM people don't really do much research on treatment. The drug companies fund that. And so what happens, what we know happens, is that people are getting these unscientifically based labels. And, sorry, this is the other bit of science you need to know. Around the time of DSM-3 and 3R, the head of those editions, Robert Spitzer, decided, well, we should do research because we need some science so we can tell people about. And so they did it was a good idea as a first step in doing research. They said, let's have a patient come in or a patient file, and we'll have 2 therapists, and we'll see, do they give that person the same DSM label? All right.
So greater reliability.
You're right. I wrote a play called Call Me Crazy that's about this, and it's a comedy drama with music, and there's this little scene where you have the Dr. X and Dr. Y, and in the background, you know, the music, dueling banjos. So this is the dueling psychiatrist scene. Okay, and that is when people see the play, they say, now you made that part up, right? Well, I put the music in there. But no, I didn't make up the fact that 2 therapists will almost never give them the same label. And they get these results, you can imagine. I mean, so much is writing on this. This is how we're going to show that the DSM is scientific, right? Well, what are they going to do? Well, they just, they faked the interpretation of the data is what they basically did. And I won't go into the statistics stuff that they did, but one of the ways they did it was to have a bunch of people in their patient sample that were diagnosed with substance abuse disorder. Well, you know what? Most of us could diagnose that, right? It's not that hard to diagnose. You don't need even 2 therapists. You don't need the DSM to diagnose that. Anyway, there was all sorts of fiddling that they did. Now, so there's no science in the DSM, and that wouldn't matter except so many people get hurt. And you just heard one of the stories. It's heartbreaking. And you know what? Except for the fact that it's motivated you to get out and help other people, I wish you hadn't had to go through that, right? Because what you just heard, this heartbreaking story, you know what people call that? They say, oh yeah, I know, diagnosis lowers self-esteem. Wow, your story is so far beyond that. It causes despair, it causes shame, it causes, as you said, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And then there's losing a job because you have a label, and then there's losing custody of your children, and then there's losing the right to make decisions about your medical and legal affairs, and on and on and on. So diagnosis is dangerous. Now, what do we do? Somebody was asking in the previous discussion session, what can we do? And here's what I want to suggest that everybody can do, in addition to saying negative effects instead of side effects, is that we have to make it socially acceptable for therapists and all the rest of us to stop using technical language. We're talking about human suffering. And if they had said, you are suffering, what is it you don't dare talk about? Or what is it you're scared of? Or what is it that torments you? How much faster might somebody have stopped drinking or stopped feeling helpless and hopeless? So we do damage. Somebody earlier said that this gentleman was talking about how medication is trauma for a lot of people. All right, so is diagnosis. Everything bad that happens to anyone ever in the mental health system starts with diagnosis, because nobody's going to diagnose you as normal and then give you electroshock or even a pill. So everything bad that happens in the mental health system starts with getting a diagnosis. And a lot of people doing wonderful work in the survivors movements and the recovery movement have focused on medication, which is extremely important, but while not noticing how fundamental are the problems with diagnosis and how damaging they are. So I think it's important to keep these things in mind. I've been living in this world for over a quarter of a century, working against psychiatric diagnosis. And the only two things that are helpful about it, that people have ever told me, one is insurance coverage. Well, you know what? There's a way to fix that, because the insurance companies know that caring therapists will say, gee, I think this person would be helped if they have 20 sessions, but if I give them the diagnosis that fits most closely, they'll only get 6, so I'm going to give them this diagnosis. Everybody knows that this is what happens, right? So why don't we just stop the lying, stop the jumping through hoops? Do what there's the Providence Center in Providence, Rhode Island. They have a problem checklist, or you just describe the problem. The person says, I'm wanting to kill myself. The person says, I don't know who I am anymore. The person says, I can't think straight. And then they come to see you, and it gets paid for. And then what happens? You keep track of how's it going with the problem. Is the problem getting less? So that would be a great way to take care of it. But of course, it's not happening right now. But talk to people about why can't we do that? I mean, raise people's consciousness. Another thing that I want to mention is that some people have said, I was so relieved to get that label because I thought, that's what's wrong with me. Now it explains a lot. Yes?
Yeah, me.
Oh, you? Yeah, right. Because if nobody's listening to you, then when somebody says, oh, you're bipolar or you're schizophrenic, okay, that's what it is. So at least I've got a name for it instead of this amorphous misery.